So welcome everybody, thank you for joining us for another of our History Talks live sessions. Today I'm to be able to introduce Dr. Kathrin Zickermann. Kathrin joined the Centre for History as a lecturer in 2011. Her research expertise focuses on two key areas. First of all, the 30 Years' War, and also more generally, early modern maritime history. And she's published numerous articles on both topics. Her first book, Across the German Sea, Early Modern Scottish Connections with Wider Elbe-Wester Region, was published by Brill in 2013. And her talk this evening is titled Bereft of All Human Help, Scottish Widows of the 30 Years' War. So over to you, Kathrin.
Thank you very much, Nicola, and thank you very much for everyone to joining this talk. I really appreciate that you're here. What I would like to do in the next 45 minutes or so is to introduce you to a project I have conceived jointly with Professor Steve Murdoch at the University of St Andrews. Steve is in the audience here as well. The project deals with Scottish widows of the 30 Years' War. Now, before I delve into the topic itself, I thought it would be useful to give you one or two sentences on the 30 Years' War itself, because I realize that not everybody here is an early modernist or a historian, because it's a public lecture. So apologies if you're already really familiar with the conflict, but this is really important information for context. So the 30 Years' War lasted from 1618 to 1648 and was played out in the Holy Roman Empire. So the forces of the Habsburg Emperor and other territorial rulers formed the so-called Catholic League, which then fought against the Protestant Union. And what is important to note is that the conflict also involved a number of foreign powers, like, for example, Denmark, Norway, Sweden, and France, which maintained also very important strategic and political interests within the Holy Roman Empire. The Dutch Republic was another country which was also drawn into the conflict as a result of its ongoing war with Habsburg Spain. And for the Dutch Republic, the 30 Years' War is actually the 80 Years' War, because it is part of its war against Spain, which started actually in 1568 with the Dutch Revolt, and was then settled within the framework of the Peace of Westphalia in 1648. So it has been established that over 50,000 Scots aided the anti-Habsburg forces throughout the 30 Years' War, and several thousand more Scots joined the opposing side. And what we also know is that most of them never made it home. So the attrition rates were really high. I think there's some guesstimates that they were about 80 or 90%. So very few soldiers actually made it home again after the conflict. And in the last 2 decades or so, a lot of substantial research has gone into the experience of the soldiers and officers who fought in the foreign armies of the 30 Years' War. For example, Steve Murdoch and Alexis Grosjean at St Andrews have done a lot of research into this. What we do not know so far is the impact this involvement had on those who actually depended on the soldiers and the officers. So in particular, we know very little about the impact of the soldiers' death on their wives and children. So Professor Murdoch and I have jointly created the Scottish Widows Project, which will fill this gap and aims to systematically analyse the experience and survival strategies of the considerable number of women and children who were left behind. One second. So what is really important to note is that the women in question formed not a homogeneous group, but included wives of different means and social standing. And the project includes, first of all, of course, women of Scottish origin. And some of them were actually born in Scotland, but many others were actually born abroad in Germany or in Sweden into soldiering families. But we've decided that we will also include women who were actually married to Scottish soldiers. So all the women we're analysing have some link to Scotland, either through birth, through their parents, or through their husbands as well. The project asked very much like how widows, some of the women were also based in Scotland, whereas others were actually based spread over other localities. For example, some of them were based in the Dutch Republic, the Holy Roman Empire, or in Scandinavia, or indeed moved between all of these locations, because some of the women were incredibly mobile. So the project will really ask how widows of different origin were perceived in these different jurisdictions. So there will be a comparative element in our project. And the long-term goal is to evaluate if the women's Scottish ethnicity or their attachment to a Scottish soldier or officer made any difference to their perception or had any impact on their success in securing a living after their husband's death. And this is especially important because the husbands obviously served in foreign armies. So analysing these women requires work in archives in all of the aforementioned locations. And sometimes it's quite difficult actually to find the relevant material. So, for example, we've realized that in Sweden, the women are all filed under the husband's names. So you usually get like a folder full of correspondence from that particular officer or soldier. And then at the bottom of that, there's usually something from their wives or widows. So it can take a wee while to actually localize the material and to find it. But Steve and I are in the process of collecting, translating and transcribing a growing corpus of widows' letters and other documents which were written in Dutch and German, Swedish, Latin and Scots. And what I would like to do today is just to introduce you to some of the widows we have already analysed and to provide some information on their fate. So what is important to note, first of all, is that there were several mechanisms which came into effect when a family lost their provider due to warfare. The first and most obvious one, perhaps, are wills and testaments, which are really important material for our project. And there are quite a few fighting soldiers who left behind wills, and this afforded a certain level of protection to their wives and children, but obviously that also depended on how much financial means there actually were to pass on to the family in a case of death. A good example comes from Leonard Graham, who was a soldier in Colonel William Brock's company within the Dutch Republic. And he made actually a joint will with his wife, Christina Bruce, in December 1653. In which both then named each other as beneficiaries in case of each other's death. And it made no difference, actually, if the wives were actually Scottish or of a Dutch origin. So there's another example of Conrad Bean, or Bain, who was a Scot, also Scot in Brock's company, and he and his Dutch wife, Elken Wilbocht's named each other as sole inheritors. And we've also come across a few cases where children were preferred in the wills over the wives. So there's one example here where John Maxwell, who was a trumpeter in the Dutch Republic, specified that his wife Janet would become his beneficiary, but only in the event that he was to die childless. Otherwise, the children would inherit. And what I would like to do is show you one very detailed. Hang on, my PowerPoint, just 1 second. Yeah, there it is. One very detailed testament. I hope you can see the slide. This is quite a good example. It's the testament will of General Sir James of Wormiston, who was not based in the Dutch Republic but in Sweden. And he drafted his will in 1641, 1 year before his death. And he was married twice, and his second wife, Margaret Forret, and their firstborn son feature quite heavily in this quote. And just to read that out to you very briefly. As my dear wife, Margaret Forret, has conducted herself lovingly and faithfully towards me, as behooves a virtuous spouse, I wish to bequeath and give to her, as according to the custom of the country, I have not earlier bestowed upon her any morning gift, namely my seat Ola, situated in upland, with the following dependencies. And then follows a description of the farms she was going to inherit, 15 in total. And then from there it follows the country seat mentioned she is to keep and to enjoy for the rest of her life, irrefutably by my children and heirs, who have with no powers to sell, mortgage, exchange, or in any way, under any pretext whatsoever, divest herself of. But if she remarries after my death, she will have to surrender the 5 farms in Grillinge, 4 in Granby, and 1 in Bergia, which 10 farms my dear son Axel Spence and his heirs would keep and enjoy for his education and maintenance. Further, after my dear wife's death, the above-mentioned Ola Manor, with all its dependencies, shall go to my above-mentioned son Axel Spence and his descendants for everlasting possession, incontestably, by all my other children. So I think this is quite an important will, because it shows that, yes, on the one hand, Spence is giving Margaret Forret, his wife, land so she can maintain her lifestyle, but she's very limited in what she can actually do with this. So he's very concerned, obviously, that the estate would remain within the family and would then be passed on to his oldest son or his other children. What is also interesting with the will is that, in the following passage, he actually protected Margaret Forret and her children from William Spence, and this was James's son from his first marriage to Agnes Dury, who received instead the rights to the main Spence barony of our home. And Spence's daughters from his first marriage, so William's sisters, also received specific gifts of money and movables, but James was very categorical that the rights of Margaret Forret were protected from any claim by his children against his estates, in particular the children from his first marriage. And to guarantee this, he made Axel and Gabriel Oxenstierna the guardians and protectors of all his children from both marriages. And this was quite a good move, because the Oxenstierna family was one of the most powerful families in the Swedish realm. And Axel Oxenstierna, you can see his picture here, he was actually the chancellor of the Swedish realm, so the most influential noble family in Sweden. So what is important here is not only the will in itself, which is quite interesting, and to see what the wife and children were actually going to inherit, but also the fact that Spence raised the possibility of remarriage. And this was certainly another mechanism which was deployed by Scottish widows to secure a livelihood. We know that about 50% of the marriages in the Scottish Dutch Brigade actually involved women who had already been married. And we have also found a few examples, specifically from Major General James Ramsay in Sweden, where women were urged in the wills to remarry. And James Ramsay made a very strong case for this, and he actually said, in the case of my death, please remarry for the protection of our child, find a suitable family to marry into. Apart from that, there were also alternative means of institutional support, ranging from involvement of local civic authorities to interventions of the Scottish widow's own monarch. But the social securities, which were on offer, obviously varied depending on which country the women were actually in. So if you take a look at the Dutch Republic, first of all, there was an institution called the Council of War, which granted some assistance to widows. If you have a look at this table, you can see, first of all, that several children received a pension with annual payments ranging from 62.5 to 200 Dutch guilders. And there's yet no explanation, I think, as to why the payment varied in the amount. So this does not seem to be dependent on the rank of the officer, nor does it depend on the gender of the child. And I'm also not sure at this stage how long the pension in the event, for the children was actually paid. So I assume that was until they had reached their majority or until they're married. So that was not a lifelong pension. But in contrast to that, the widows, which you can see here, 4 in total, were actually receiving a lifelong pension. And again, the amount really varies. And again, it is not dependent on the rank of the officer they were married to. But there seemed to have been like a system in place here where children and widows received financial support. This changed a little bit after the end of the 12 years truce between the Dutch Republic and Spain, and the subsequent siege of Bergen-op-Zoom in 1622. And this is when the Dutch began to decline applications for pensions. So we have an example of Delia Butler, who was the widow of Captain David Ramsay, who petitioned for a lifelong pension, but was instead awarded a sum of 80 guilders to facilitate her return to Scotland. What is quite interesting about her case is that she had previously brought a case against Colonel Buckluch, who was the commanding officer of her husband, who had apparently seduced her when she was 15 and fathered a child by her. And she successfully fought for custody of the child and received financial compensation. And it seems like the Dutch authorities were really not wanting to go into a second round of compensation for her, and they gave her some money to return to Scotland, basically to get rid of her. Another example is Anna Kilpatrick, who was the widow of Colonel Robert Henderson, and faced similar problems when the council hesitated to grant her pension request. She was initially only allowed 3 months of her husband's pay, and this was only as Henderson had apparently fought very bravely and fearlessly in battle. And it was only after King James VI and members of the Scottish Privy Council that became involved in her case and put pressure on the Dutch Council of War that she was awarded an annual pension of 300 and then later 500 guilders annually. However, she also petitioned to have this pension then later transferred to her children, but that was unsuccessful. And then a final example in this context is Christina Boswell, who was the widow of Lieutenant Colonel Alan Coutts, who also petitioned the Council of State from May 1631. And like Kilpatrick, she had very moderate success, as she only achieved like one-off irregular payments here and there, but not a lifelong pension, which seemed to have always been the golden goal of these widows. They're always petitioning, to have maintenance for the rest of their lives. And the Council of State came back to her and it basically said it would be too great a burden for the country to support the widows of all captains and officers. And they basically tried to get away with not paying a lifelong pension to her. And Christina Boswell was in a much worse position than Kilpatrick, because in her case, the Scottish Privy Council did not become involved, and that obviously weakened her case. And yeah, she got like just a few irregular payments. And I think we can see from her petitions that she became increasingly desperate. So she remains in the Dutch Republic, and she petitions again and again and again and again, but she was unsuccessful, basically. But I think, yeah, just shows her desperation and her case, that she had to try for many, many years to squeeze a lifelong pension out of the Dutch institutions. So the Dutch authorities were clearly less keen to assist Scottish widows after 1622, and their financial support was very patchy at best. They tried to tie annual pensions to particular bravery of the soldiers. That's another thing which stands really out here. And presumably to instigate more heroic and valiant behavior amongst the troops. But despite the fact that they deployed delaying tactics and were not able or willing to pay all the widows, there was, on the other hand, I think, like this clear expectation from the widows themselves that they should, and also from the Scottish authorities as well. If you turn to Sweden, widows were in a different position here. In Sweden, widows were often given a so-called nådår, which means a year of mercy, which basically meant that the salary of their husbands was paid for an additional year after their death to support them for a short period of time. But this was not an automatic process. It was more like a custom. So we do find petitions also from Scottish widows who are asking to be paid for an additional year. Apart from this nådår, some widows were able to utilize another reward for military service in Sweden, which came in the form of land donations, which were issued by the Crown. And these land donations were located either in Sweden or in the newly acquired territories within the Holy Roman Empire. So, for example, in Pomerania or in Bremen and Verden, or other parts of the Swedish realm. But the catch with those was that they were usually tied to the defense and maintenance of the land. So it was in the interest of the Swedish Crown to actually recover the land donations, which were given to the husbands after they had died. However, the Swedish Council of the Realm recognized the plight of the bereaved families and sought to implement measures to alleviate their fate. And it altered an existing policy to allow the widow of the recipient of a land donation to maintain the property so long as she did not remarry. But again, there was another caveat with this. The widow had to be mentioned in the original land donation. Otherwise, the land reverted also to the Crown immediately. So overall, institutional support, whether in the Dutch Republic or in Sweden, remains very unreliable, leaving widows to turn to their own or their dead husbands' social networks for support. And many utilized the social capital with individuals at the highest level of the military leadership or sent requests directly to the Swedish government. And these requests were either referring to any financial requests, so for example, outstanding debts to their late husbands, or any other form of maintenance, land donations, and so on. One good example is this petition here, which is from Anna Uhlenbrock, who was the widow of the Scottish Colonel Jacob or James Johnston, who entered Swedish service in 1624 and became the commandant of Kirchholm Scots, which was close to Riga, and received his own regiment in 1653. And the petition was originally written in German, but I've done my best to translate for you. And unfortunately, I can't see it because I can only see myself here on a little screen. I have to just move that around. So, okay, so here goes the petition, or my translation of the German petition. I am deserted by everybody and have to tell your excellency with great lament and with eyes that are dripping with blood that my loving husband, the colonel and commandant of Kirchholm, Jacob Johnston, has died prematurely. Since he has not received a salary for the duration of 2 years, he cannot be buried in the ground. Therefore, in this highest state of distress, I ask Your Excellency to have mercy on this body, who was a loyal servant to the Crown of Sweden, and give me 1 year worth of the debts owed to him, so that he can be buried in the ground with Christian rites. Sorry, and again, I have to move the screen a bit. If you were not to take mercy on me, a poor and saddened widow, I would have to leave the body in the street, giving a fright to all and everyone who is serving the Swedish crown. However, since Your Excellency keeps a merciful eye on all widows and orphans, I am hopeful that you will bless me with your mercy. I implore the highest God, who is the rewarder to all who are doing good deeds for widows and orphans, to reward Your Excellency for your help 100,000-fold. I live and die in expectation of merciful help. Your Excellency's loyal petitioner before God, Margareta Ullenbrock. So this is obviously a very emotional plea to Magnus de la Gardie, who was the Swedish Lord High Treasurer and also a military commander. And there are also very, very strong religious connotations in this petition. But there's also this hint of a threat here, obviously, saying, well, you know, if I can't bury my husband, I just put him out in the street. And then, that's not a very good image for the for the Swedish crown, obviously. And this theme of the burial of husbands is quite a common one that comes up a lot in these petitions, always about, you know, giving the husbands a good burial and to give them the respect they deserve in death as well as in life. And then I have another nice example here for you. This is another request made by the widow of Colonel George Leslie, who addressed the Swedish Chancellor Axel Oxenstierna in January 1639. And she wrote the following: I have to tell Your Excellency that my late husband, Colonel Leslie, the commandant at Fechter, has lost his life during a siege in the service of the Swedish crown. Under these distressing circumstances, I have to bother you with this, my humble letter, and to remind you most subserviently that my late husband had received a patent from the Scottish crown for 4 companies. However, he had only received half of the recruitment money, namely 3,000 imperial dollars. Since I have heard that many or all of the officers in my late husband's regiment want to send a captain or another representative to request recruitment money or other matters in regard to the regiment, I want to ask Your Excellency most humbly not to send any money before Your Excellency receives further report from Field Marshal Leslie, as he knows all things better than I do. I will receive post from Field Marshal Leslie soon and will advise Your Excellency shortly. So behind this letter is clearly a worry that the officers and not the widow herself would receive the outstanding sums of money. And what I find really very interesting about her letter is that it shows a degree of agency here. So she's clearly still very much connected to her late husband's regiment. She knows what is going on, and she very much tries to preempt the officers' activities. And the other thing I think is just very striking here is that she is also in touch with Field Marshal Alexander Leslie, who is again one of the highest commanders of the Swedish army. Alexander Leslie was a half-brother to her late husband, so he's a kinsman, but at the same time, she is still in contact with him. She receives direct post from him, which is also really, really interesting, and she clearly is supported by him after her husband's death. So these are just 2 of numerous examples of Scottish widows writing to the highest Swedish military leadership with specific requests. And another really interesting widow of whom we have a bit more information is Isabelle Spence. And I would like to tell you a little bit more about her, because she also deploys certain tactics to have her requests granted. So she was basically another Scottish widow who petitioned Axel Oxenstierna for reimbursement of her late husband's service. But she's also interesting for other reasons, I think. So like Ulenbrock and Leslie's widow, Isabel initially accompanied her husband, James Ramsay, whilst he fulfilled his duties in the Holy Roman Empire. However, when Ramsay took over his position as governor in Hanau, which is in Hessen, somewhere in the Holy Roman Empire, Ramsay basically sent her back to Scotland for her own safety. And after he had successfully defended Hanau under very difficult circumstances, he was promised a huge compensation for his service to the value of 50,000 imperial dollars. But the sum was, and what is really interesting about that sum is that it was to be used specifically for Isabel's maintenance in Scotland. And also to buy some estates in the Swedish realm to compensate for other estates he had lost in Mecklenburg, which was now overrun by the enemy. However, he never received the sum because he was actually taken prisoner, and he died in captivity. So Isabelle Spence, upon the death of her husband, started to petition Axel Oxenstierna, seeking reimbursement for her husband's long and loyal service, and presumably also, although she doesn't mention a specific sum, for this payment which was promised to her husband. And this was initially dismissed, and Isabel claimed that she had no financial means to repatriate her husband's body. So as I said, this is quite a common theme, what happens to the husband's bodies. In order to enforce the claim, she took then this very interesting decision to relocate from St. Andrews, where she was based, to Stockholm in the mid-1640s. And her physical presence in the capital then had the desired effect, and she was eventually successful. So her son, David, received land donations as a reward for his father's loyal service. And that included a village and several farms. But these were given to him under the condition that Isabel was actually going to hold them until her death. And she was actually residing on one of these farms. And we are not quite sure yet if she actually linked up with the rest of her family, because she was the stepdaughter of Margaret Forret, who was also present in Stockholm, which is quite close to where she received the estates, and also her half-brothers, Axel and David. But what we do know is that Isabel was in touch with another family, a Scottish family called Moneypenny, and she was vaguely related to them through one of her other sisters who had married into the family. But some of the members of the Moneypenny family also lived on her farms. And as a side note, I'm finding this really interesting because when we're looking into Scottish communities abroad, we are usually looking into the urban spaces. But here we have a good example of Scottish families connecting in the countryside, in the Swedish countryside as well. So I think this is something which definitely deserves further investigation. So Isabel's petition may or may not also have been helped by the fact that she was actually the stepdaughter of Margaret Forret, and also the daughter of Sir James Spence, who was a very important military commander and linked very closely to Axel Oxenstierna. Margaret Forret herself was very close acquaintance of Axel Oxenstierna, and she was provided for through her husband's will, which I mentioned at the start of this paper, which granted her some estates. However, what's interesting about her is that she did not solely rely on these, but also used her own agency with the crown to gain advantages for her family. So after her husband passed away, she persuaded Queen Christina to pay an annual sum of 600 imperial dollars for the education of her children. And Margaret also remained in contact with Oxenstierna and penned several letters to him, in which she expressed her concerns, basically, that her late husband was not afforded the respect in death that he was afforded in life. So again, she's referring to her husband's body, and claims that it remained unburied, and her family was apparently mocked for this, and also she had a lot of creditors apparently on her case, which asked her for bills which she could not afford to pay. And then she made the point that the deaths of her husband actually resulted from expenses from his last mission to the British Isles, which he had undertaken on behalf of the Swedish crown. So she reminded Oxenstierna of his obligations to her and her family, and asked him to intervene on her behalf at the Swedish Council of the realm. And indeed, the council discussed her case in 1634, and it was decided that Margaret should receive a payment for some of Spence's expenses. But this was only partially successful. So she wanted to actually have a bit more, but the council nevertheless gave her some of the requested sums. So Oxenstierna's intervention was at least partially successful. Axel Oxenstierna was, of course, also the guardian of her sons, and he very much helped them and also their half-brother, Colonel William Spence, to be elevated into the Swedish nobility. And Oxenstierna did this through a very special dispensation from the crown, which even allowed the sons actually to keep their Calvinist faith, which was quite unusual because Sweden is obviously a Lutheran country. But there was an exception was being made for Margaret Forest's sons, and they could continue to adhere to Calvinist faith. After her immediate financial difficulties were resolved, Margaret continued her correspondence with Oxenstierna, and sometimes even serving as a conduit between him and her second husband, Colonel Hugo Hamilton. For example, we find her passing on information from Hamilton in regard to diplomatic meetings, and even in some cases military intelligence. So she kind of, she knew very much what was going on, and her husband trusted her then to pass on information on his behalf to Oxenstierna. Margaret Forest died in 1653, and she was buried in the Riddarholm Kyrka church in the middle of Stockholm. And this is also quite remarkable because it is actually the burial ground of quite a few Swedish kings. But her husband is also actually buried there. I'm not quite sure. I have to ask Steve after this talk if he knows if we can actually see her epitaph or some like her grave in the church. I'm not quite sure about that. But so that is her final resting place. And I gave you one more and final example in this context of another really interesting lady and Scottish widow called Martha Stewart, who actually also died in 1653, the same year as Margaret Forest. And she was also really interesting for a different reason, I think. So she was actually born in Scotland and moved to Sweden sometime during her childhood, because her relatives served also the Swedish crown. And she married a Frenchman, a French lieutenant colonel called Anton Udron in 1625. I'm not quite sure when she married, but she was widowed in 1632 because her husband died at the Battle of Nuremberg. And like Isabelle Spence and Margaret Forest, she sent a very typical petition to Oxenstierna, highlighting her husband's long and loyal service of 26 years, followed then by a request to help in alleviating the pressures of widowhood. So in that sense, she's not very unusual and just follows the same pattern as many widows. And it's not quite clear if she immediately received help from the Chancellor, but in the late 1640s, Oxenstierna actually becomes involved, and he acts as patron for Martha on several occasions. Martha also asks him for help in regard to one of her sons who was joining a Swedish service. According to Martha, her son was unable to pay for a horse to join the cavalry, so she pleaded with Axel Oxenstierna to have a word with her fellow countryman, General Robert Douglas, to equip her son until he could repay him. And she also asked him to request from Douglas that he would send as a guarantor to pay a ransom should her son become a captive. And her sons were eventually ennobled as well in 1649, and this was also because Oxenstierna became involved and helped her with that particular request. But what is really interesting about her is not that she had, like the ear of Oxenstierna and also through him of Robert Douglas. But what is particularly interesting about her is that she maintained her own estates, and she had her own farm on the island of Almu, which you can see on the map here. And what is interesting about that is that Almu was actually very close to Tidö Castle, which you can also see on the map, and that is Oxenstierna's castle. So she is in very close proximity to the Swedish Chancellor, also quite close to Stockholm, as you can see on the other map. The island is situated in Lake Mälaren. So when I was reading her correspondence, I was really, at first, really puzzled because a lot of her later correspondence with Oxenstierna is about agricultural matters. So she's asking him to sell her a few horses, and then there's a flood on her farm. And I was just really wondering, why do you address the Swedish Chancellor about these matters? But it is because they are neighbors. They're farming in close proximity, and she expects them, or she requests for help on several occasions when there is a problem with her farm, and she reports like a lot of disasters happening and so on in regards to her farming. So very briefly at the end of my talk, just two more cases which I also find really interesting. So the three women I've just mentioned, so Isabelle Spence, Martha Stewart, and Margaret Forret, they were obviously they are taking recourse to the Swedish military command. So they're addressing Axel Oxenstierna and through him other military commanders. But we also find examples from Scottish widows who are seeking help from their own monarchs, basically. So one example is Margaret Lindsay, who was the widow of a surgeon called William Welch, who had served in the Danish and the Swedish army. And after her husband's death, she petitioned Charles I to receive her late husband's outstanding salary and expenses, as she viewed the recruiting colonel, Donald Mackay, Lord Reay, as responsible for the debts owing to her husband and not the Danish or the Swedish crown. So this is quite different, obviously, to the other examples I've just given you. And then we also find other widows who requested help from their relatives. So, for example, Isabel Forbes petitioned her kinsman, Colonel William Forbes, as she could not maintain her family, which at this point not only included her own children, but she had also taken in the children of another Scottish family because the mother had been killed by a cannon shot. And she had apparently received some compensation from a Swedish general, Lennart Torstensson, but this has been interrupted for some time, so she was in financial difficulties. And in this situation, she addressed her kinsman, William Forbes, and he was not able to help her. But what he did was he sent her request further up the extended kinship line to the General Arvid Forbes, who Isabel presumably had never met, but he just passed it up basically within the family to the person who was in the highest command. So coming to a conclusion here, I think that was quite obvious, and is that the death of the husbands clearly caused severe difficulties and hardship for all the women I have referred to in this paper, at least to a certain degree. However, most of the Scottish widows were not helpless victims, but could to a certain extent rely on extended networks when institutional support failed. And these support networks were activated through the widows' correspondence, which took the form of letters and petitions. And these documents in themselves raise further questions in regard, for example, in regard to the women's literacy. So on this slide, you can see Martha Stewart's various signatures. Thank you very much, Sue, for sending that along. And I think these reveal that she was probably illiterate, because the signature varies from letter to letter. But then if you look at the next one, this is a letter from Margaret Lindsay. You can see, if you look at the bottom of the slide, she was literate in Scots. So there's a little postscriptum here in Scots, and that's in the same handwriting as her signature. So that obviously deserves further analysis in the future to ask us questions about literacy, which are obviously very important when we come to these women. What is really interesting is that the women, to a certain extent, were not behaving much differently when the men. So that's something we have discussed recently, because if you compare the petitions from the women to petitions from men, there are similar patterns. So the women very often refer, to long service of their husbands, make themselves known, like tell something about their family, and then obviously refer to the long and loyal service and so on. I think what is slightly different with the women's petition is that they are perhaps more focused on the children as well. So that is another theme which obviously comes up quite a lot with the women's request in general. So it's always about, making sure that the children also have an outcome, like an income, that they are maintained. And at the same time, when support is given from the authorities, they always include the children. So they're saying, okay, we are not giving you any money, but we have already given your son, a position in the army, and that should be enough compensation for at the moment. So it's quite interesting that the children are always coming into the picture here as well. What I'm finding also important to mention is that there were obviously also less visible support mechanisms, networks in place. So women were obviously managing by themselves when their husbands were abroad or away on military duty and so on. And their husbands, as we know, they were not paid for several years in some case. So what's happening in those years? The women must have had some financial support or some networks already in place, and they lasted longer when the husbands lasted beyond the husbands' deaths for sure. So it's not like that they're all of a sudden becoming helpless, I think, when the husband dies. And I think we have seen, for example, the case of Martha Stewart as really quite important here, I think, because she manages fine. She's one of the women who does not remarry. And I think that was a choice. And she manages fine on her own farm and on this little island in Lake Maileran. And she does not seem to be in need of another husband. And there are quite a few examples of women who do not remarry, although of course many do. But some women are managing really fine by themselves. Another point, a final point perhaps I want to mention, is also the mobility, which I'm finding really interesting. So I've mentioned this case of Delia Butler at the start. She's moving back from the Dutch Republic to Scotland. But Isabelle Spence is moving from Scotland to Sweden to make to make her case, and that is a successful move. So very finally, where's the project going from here? I think what we need to do in the future is to do more archival research, in particular in the Swedish, but also especially in the German archives. I think there's a lot more material which is waiting to be dug out there. As I mentioned previously, what we want to do long term is to find out if widows were treated differently based on their Scottish origin or their attachment to a Scottish soldier. Does that actually matter? And then we will also analyze. Sorry, I lost my thread there. Yeah, and also, yeah, exactly, depending on where they resided. I think that is also really interesting because they were obviously located in different parts in the Swedish realm. If you leave out the Dutch Republic for a moment, but if you look into the Swedish realm itself, they were present in different jurisdictions. So, for example, Pomerania or Bremen-Verden, and then the Swedish realm itself. So I think we have to take a closer look into the provision, the general provision of widows under different jurisdictions as well. And this will tie in really well with other ongoing projects. So, for example, I've started to look into the Scottish communities and Swedish Pomerania. And it will be really interesting to see, I think, if the Scottish military widows actually linked up with the fellow countrymen and women who were located in the Baltic ports, just to see if they created any special networks in these localities. And this also fits really well with other research which is going on elsewhere at the moment. So really exciting research. So, for example, Rebecca Mason is conducting really fabulous research at the moment into Scottish women and property and law. So it will tie in really well with that. And also the Civil Wars, the Civil War petitions project in England as well. So this is a topic which will very much go with this. And I think it's very important to do this. So thank you very much for listening today.
Thank you very much indeed, Kate. That was a really, really interesting talk and gave us some great insights into a wonderful project. You actually answered one of my own questions right at the end there, so thank you for that. I was wanting to know a wee bit about where research was going from here, because it's so exciting, I think. So it was great to hear the various ways in which it's going to go forward, and also how it connects to different projects that are ongoing. So we'll open the floor up to questions. We started about 5 or so minutes late, so we've got at least 10 minutes for questions. So please feel free, if you want to come in, you can just unmute yourself. As I said before, the mute/unmute button should be at the bottom in the middle of your screen. You can do that, or if you would like to, I think everyone should have access to a chat facility. So if you don't have audio, you can just type your question into the chat. Quite shy, so I'll get us started. I wondered, I understand this might not be something that really can be answered, but when you were talking about petitions and the different petitions sort of to institutional support and kind of more towards family and kinship networks, I wondered if you had any inclination of the kind of success rate of these, and particularly when you mentioned about the funeral, the sort of plea for help for funeral costs. I wonder if that had any real impact on whether these things were taken up or not.
I don't think we have like a percentage for something like that. Unfortunately, I think we can just go on a case-by-case basis, so I'm not sure, to be honest. I think it really depends on so many factors. I think it depends on how well they're connected, who they ask, the standing of their late husbands as well. So I think I think the further along we go in the project, the more we will be able to answer this question, obviously. But I think it depends on just so many different factors. Yeah. So at the moment, no, I don't think it's I can give a proper answer to that.
That's absolutely fair enough. I thought that might be the case, even just in terms of the evidence surviving.
I'm not sure if Steve, do you want to add to that, or on a
well, I think it's soldiers who worked in Scots armies, perhaps to France and Spain. Maybe more. We think about how many of those married or got married, and then we think about how many petitions, wills, letters we're dealing with. We're not even touching the surface of the mass of the widows, abandoned wives, etc. that we've got. What we can say is the Dutch record base for widows' wills and testaments is really good. And if we hammered away at all the local archives in the Netherlands, we would be able to establish something. We know that as you pointed out in your talk, you've got to be trained Jesuits to actually find the widows in the archives, because it's so complicated the way that we have it. Well, you know this, Kathrin, covered how to find them, the various codes that we've done so on. We haven't looked at the German archive yet. The problem is that when we get a widow, I beg your pardon, a soldier being buried, it might often just say, here is a soldier, here is an officer who is buried, here is a child who's being buried. Their widow was present, but we don't actually know who they are. So that gets really tough. So we're dealing with a very, very small fraction of the widows who inevitably lived during the 30 Years' War to witness their husbands die. But what we have to be very careful about, I think we've both Kathrin and I have tried to do this, is to, in our written work and various articles we've done about this, is to not overstate what we've got. That the majority of the widows that we've got are going to be coming from officers' wives. And that's where people like Isabel Forbes is unique. Not quite unique, but very rare, in that we're getting an insight into what happens to lower ranked soldiers, private soldiers, and that's where Dutch archives come in as a great comparative, because they're so good at recording their wills. We have actually got a valuable list of letters from the Dutch notarial archives. Is one of the areas of Europe you've looked at?
Not necessarily, no. I mean, the question I was going to ask was about, I know I've talked about this with you before, Kathrin, about gravestones as a source of evidence. If there were graves of these women, which could be quite revealing, because I know looking at Scottish migration to Poland, Lithuania, that's been one of the real insights of the last few years, has been analysis of epitaph and epigraph evidence, which has shown evidence of women, but also baptism records. So more records of the children, and that might reveal a bit more about some of the social networks of the individuals involved, for example, fosterage or godparentage and so on.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's something I'm definitely going to look into when I'm looking at the Scottish communities in Pomerania. And I think, yeah, you're absolutely right. I think gravestones, epitaphs and so on are a fantastic source for women, because, yeah, very often we don't find that much background information on them. So demographic registers, church registers obviously come in here as well. And that is really, really interesting and important. But it's also, it's backbreaking work, because in Germany, especially, it's you're dealing with lots and lots of different decentralized small archives. They're open maybe 5 minutes per day or something. So if you want to access these materials, which really but these are the most important materials, in regard to women, obviously, that is the work which needs to be done still, and also obviously, yeah, looking for the gravestones. I expect to find quite a few of those in Pomerania, but also eulogies. I think that's another great source. So again, obviously, the women have to have a certain social standing to be able, to find them in those, but I came, from my other research, I've come across a few eulogies of women who were married to Scottish soldiers and officers, and they obviously go into the whole life story, and the husbands as well, but also the women and children and so on. So those are really important sources which have not been really analysed yet, I think. So I think this is really important work which needs to be done.
And presumably that looks quite different in a Lutheran context in the Swedish territories than it would in the Calvinist context of the Dutch world.
Yeah, that's a good point, actually. Yes, yeah, presumably, yes.
Yeah, if I can just add to that, some of the graves that cathedral, or even in the Kyrkan, as mentioned earlier, the main cathedral burial place of the kings, they contain Maria Neve in Tours is the most famous. I mean, it's a stunning example of a tomb monument, which you would not get in a Calvinist context. But there's a problem there also in that sometimes the women are more prominent than they should be. So, for example, when I asked at Riederholmskirken if I could see a photograph of Margaret Forrett's grave, they sent me it, and it's a completely bare marble slab, because it's front and center in front of the altar, and it's been stepped on for 350 years. And any information we could have got from it is gone, absolutely gone. So she was a victim of a test, but then she was also abnormal. Most of the women are not buried in such high status graves as Margaret.
Yeah, and her husband is there as well. So, so it's yeah. But nevertheless, it's a really important burial place, obviously in the middle of Stockholm, with the Swedish kings as well.
Do we have anyone else want to come in with a question? I thought I heard someone opening their mic there, but I'm not too sure.
Kathrin, do you have examples of some of these women getting drawn into like kind of legal battles over inheritance or anything like that? I mean, or is there not enough evidence of that?
Yeah, yes, there's some evidence, but I have not really analysed it yet. But there is quite a lot. So I think the cases in the Hofrätten, I think that's one of the most one of the highest courts in Sweden. I think they've just become available online, I think, from the Swedish Riksarkivet. So that's one of the next steps I think we have to take and go into these legal records to see for women, to look for women who are actually fighting wills, for example, and so on, and making sure they get the proper maintenance. I know that Rebecca Mason is doing that in Scotland, I think. So this is quite interesting, and then to compare that with what is going on in the Swedish institution, in the Swedish courts as well. I'm sure there's loads there.
If I can add to that, Ian, very often what we get is it's not so much that the widows are fighting legal cases. I think people will accept that when they're petitioning and they bring to bear kith and kin, to bring to bear the Scottish Privy Council intervention by Charles I or whatever, or it's accepted that this is okay. Legal cases is in the case of abandoned women rather than widows. Alas, we've got too many of our soldier boys, Highlanders, Robert Munro of Phyllis for one, who would marry a woman, spend every part of the inheritance, and then go and join the army to hide from it. And we do have these cases and that is legal. So, for example, the English wife of Monroe wins the court case several times over, because as you have regime change and people see it as not their problem anymore, what was very nice was that the Monroe family, Hector Monroe in particular, was able to come in and say, no, she's quite right. We will protect her. We will give her her due, and that's reconfirmed. Now that happened in the 1620s, and that's reconfirmed as late as the Restoration, that she's still in court. But the Monroe family, the main inheritors of the Monroe family, protect her. We've got another case just come up by a widow, not a widow, but a woman called Thompson, who's also English. She's just looking for her husband. He came, he married me, he's gone. And there's even a German poem, I think, which I heard Kathrin say at a conference about 20 years ago, that Scotsman, he diddled me. Is that not good? Was it not actually a thing about Scots actually marrying their German women and then doing a runner?
Yeah, I vaguely remember that.
20 years ago since a certain conference that Kathrin and David and I all met. There you go.
We probably have time for one last quick question, if anyone has one. No? If not, we will just send our virtual round of applause to Kathrin and thank her once again for a really wonderful paper. And thank you to everyone else for coming along.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Thanks, Kathrin. Bye.